over places that fire. The shroud went through 3 fires through its history. So we see some of those areas here where the shroud was repaired. So that's one of the first things that we have is the front and the back image. So this is the front. So this is what would have been pressed against the front part of Jesus. And this is what would have been pressed against the back part of Jesus. Okay, so when we're looking at the shroud, we need to understand that and realize that as we look at it, the wounds that you see on the left are actually on the right, and the wounds that are on the right really were on the left because it was pressed against Jesus. So it's kind of like a mirror effect, like when you're looking at yourself in the mirror. And then also down here on the floor, this is the positive image of the shroud. So if you look at the shroud, this is what it looks like. But then in 1898, a man named Segundo Pio, he actually put out negative images of the shroud, and this took the world by storm, really. It shocked many people in the world when they were able to see negative images of the shroud. So tonight, when we're finished with the presentation, if you want to come forward and see some of the things that I'm going to reference here on the shroud, you can. So this is the negative image of the shroud, and in it, when we look at the negative images, we actually see what's called blood serum halos. And that's very important for us to understand because when you expose the shroud to ultraviolet light, these halos tend to glow a little bit. And that's important because my job tonight is to prove to you that the shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. It's not a clever medieval forgery, which is what some people say in the world today about the shroud. We're going to talk about why it's not a forgery this evening. That's my goal, is to help you to know that what we're looking at and what is in Turin, the original, is not a forgery. It truly is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. A few other things that we have over here this evening is this is not what we would consider a true replica of the crown of thorns. When we look at art in the church, we always look at art for the course of our lifetime and we say, okay, well, this is what this must have looked like, right? And the true crown of thorns would have been more like a helmet. And the crown of thorns literally touched Jesus's head in over 50 places. And it would have literally, some of those thorns would have literally have penetrated into his head. And so oftentimes we like to say that Jesus had 5 wounds, right? 2 feet wounds, 2 in his hands, and 1 in the side, pierced through the right side. But we forget that the shroud tells us that Jesus had 240 lacerations on his back, 120 lacerations on his front. And so when we think about that, and we also think about the wounds of Jesus, and I know that you have a lovely statue over there of one of my favorite saints in the corner, and that is Saint Rita of Cassia. Saint Rita had 1 crown of thorns, and that 1 wound caused her excruciating pain and a lot of suffering in her life in the 13th century, early 14th century when she lived. And that 1 wound in and of itself was bad for her to endure. So just imagine, what Christ endured. So when we talk about his wounds, it was more than 5 wounds, right? And that's what this is all about right here, is to help you to understand a little bit of what Jesus looked like when Pontius Pilate showed him to those who were there in the praetorium and said, "Ecce homo," behold the man. Jesus literally was torn from top to bottom, as we see in the shroud. So it would have looked more like a helmet. But what's important about this crown when you come up at the end is to know that this crown is made with the same species of thorn bush that the real crown of thorns was made out of. So the length of these and how permanent these are, this is now 20 years old, this crown of thorns. And just to help you to understand how resilient it is. I carry this crown around for shroud presentations often, just so you can come up and not to push hard on it, but to literally just put your finger on one of these thorns to understand what happened when they took this crown, put it on Jesus' head, and then they took a rod and they beat downward on that crown of thorns, what it would have been like penetrating into Christ's skull. Also up here tonight, I have what are called railroad spikes. Most people don't get a chance to literally go up to a railroad and see what spikes look like. Jesus's would have been this long, but they weren't quite this wide, okay? They would have been a little narrower than this, but not by much. And so this helps you to understand a little bit of what pierced Jesus's hands and his feet. I'll pass this around. This is show and tell, so it's designed for you to kind of touch it, feel it, get close to it. Up here also we have a first century nail. So this is a small version of a first century nail, but this is a first century nail. And it'll give you an idea of what it kind of looked like, but just imagine it was bigger. We actually know how big the nails were that pierced Jesus' hands and feet, because in the Vatican today, the Vatican possesses at the Church of Santa Croce in Jerusalem in Rome, one of the nails that literally was used to crucify Jesus. We also have at the Vatican, well, in Santa Croce, but owned by the Vatican, the title that was over Jesus' head that was written in 3 languages. We have that. We have some of the thorns from the original crown of thorns. The base of that crown that actually would have kind of held it together is at Notre Dame in France. And usually during Lent, if you're there on a Friday, you can go and venerate the relic of the crown of thorns. Also here tonight, we have 2 coins. And these 2 coins date from the 1st century. And we believe that when Jesus was being prepared in the tomb, they literally put 2 coins over his eyelids so as to keep them shut. And today, you may not know this, but if you talk to a funeral director, they're going to tell you that often when they're preparing a body, they will literally put a little adhesive on the edge of the eyelids just to make sure that the eyes stay closed, so that when you go forward to visit a body, an eye doesn't just automatically open during a viewing, which I'm sure would cause distress to many people if that happened during a wake, right? So anyway, primitively, they would have put coins over the deceased eyelids just to keep the eyes closed. So these are actually minted during the time of Pontius Pilate and Herod the Great. And so these are 2 copies, well, not copies, but actually real-life coins that were found in the Holy Land that are part of our exhibit tonight. Don't take one of these for your personal possession when you come up here now. His father will have to dispense you from Father Palermo saying you'll go to purgatory, okay? If you take these, all right? So anyway, one of these days I'd like to have one of the scourging whips, just to show people what those look like too as part of the exhibit. So that's kind of what we have up here this evening. I would like to start our conversation about the shroud, if you would, to look at your handout. And tonight I don't want you to kind of like look at the handout all night. I want you to look at the shroud. And we're going to talk a little bit about the shroud this evening, but in the event that I miss something in this presentation tonight, this is a good, concise, 6-page summary of a lot of information about the shroud. There's a lot of technical words in here, and I might struggle with some of that because I'm going to let you know I'm not a medical expert. Father Kerry Bainey, he's our priestly medical expert in the Diocese of Baton Rouge, okay? My expertise is more in the realm of finance. That's what I did before I entered the seminary. And so this is a hobby of mine, to know about this, to research this, to be curious about this and present upon it. But there are people who actually have master's degrees in what's called syndenology. And syndenology is the study of the shroud, the synden, as it's called. And I'm not one of those people who have a licentiate in sacred theology and syndonology. This is a hobby, and it's a beautiful grant that allowed us to get all these different things that we come and present to parishes on during this time of the year with the Shroud. And I'm very grateful that I'm able to present here for the first time this evening, so it's good to be with you. Our discussion tonight actually goes to Easter Sunday, to the reading of Easter Sunday. And it takes place in John's Gospel. John, who was an eyewitness to the resurrection, he was one of the first to go into the tomb and to see what it looked like. And he tells us in exacting detail in just a few sentences what happened that morning to help us realize what he was looking at. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to go into the tomb today with John and Peter. And we're going to hear what they say. And it's very important for us to understand that John, in a few sentences, really encapsulates what we believe in the faith. Why do people think this is a forgery today? Well, my thought about that is if you were saved, if you were the devil, and you wanted people to deny the Christian faith, what would you attack? The resurrection. The resurrection. And so, what is the greatest proof of the resurrection? The shroud. John Paul II called this the greatest relic we possess in Christianity. You realize when we look at the shroud, you might say, well, what's so important about the shroud? I'm going to tell you. We know how tall Jesus was. He was 5'9" to 5'11". He weighed 175 pounds. He was built man. You look at him. This is a healthy man in the shroud. Ladies, he was a tall, good-looking, built man. Jesus was hot. Okay? And it's important for us to understand that about Jesus. From the shroud, when we look at this face right here, we understand all of a sudden where every image in the early history of the church, where it came from, where our pictures of Jesus came from. It came from that face. And so, if you want to discount the resurrection, you basically say, this is a forgery. This is a forgery. That's how Satan is, right? You go on YouTube today, there's a lot of good research. It's all right here, very concisely presented to you in this little paper. And yet, you go online, you're going to see just as much against the shroud as you're going to find for the shroud. And the reason is the devil doesn't have to work so hard these days. We have these things called satellites in space. We have this stuff called the internet. We have fiber optic cable running everywhere. And so the devil doesn't have to work hard to trip people up and get them into sin. He just gets them addicted to stuff on the internet like TikTok. Okay? So, with that said tonight, you're here because you want to be convinced in the resurrection. That's at the central aspect of your faith. That's what we profess on Sunday in the Creed, right? So let's hear what John has to say about the resurrection in just a few sentences, and in it, we're in the tomb with him. We don't have to go to Jerusalem and go to the tomb. We're going to hear from John today, and we're going to look up here and we're going to understand all of a sudden that the resurrection was a real event. So let's pray. On the first day of the week, Mary of Magdala came to the tomb in the morning while it was still dark and saw the stone removed from the tomb. So she ran and she went to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved. Time out. The disciple whom Jesus loved. The signature of St. John the Evangelist. All of us need to have as our signature one day and come to understand we are a disciple whom Jesus loves, right? All of us need to associate with what John felt about himself, that we are disciples whom Jesus loves. So, she says, They have taken the Lord from the tomb, and we don't know where they put him." So Peter and the other disciple went out and came to the tomb. They both ran, but the other disciple ran faster than Peter and arrived at the tomb first. He was a lot younger, wasn't he? He could run faster. So he stoops down, and we hear here a Greek term for saw, blepo. He stooped down and he saw the burial cloths there, but did not go in. When Simon Peter arrived after him, he went into the tomb and saw, there the Greek is theopeo, the burial cloths there. And this is important. And the cloth that had covered his head, not with the burial cloths, but rolled up in a separate place. Then the other disciple also went in, the one who had arrived at the tomb first, and he saw Hereo and believed, for they did not yet understand the scripture that he had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned home. Now this is important because there's this development that's taking place with Peter and John. And words matter in the scriptures, and that's why it's important for us to really understand what's happening in the scriptures. It's just like the part where we hear in John chapter 21, where Jesus goes and finds Peter on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus and some of the others had left the upper room. They had walked 4 days back. And theologians will tell us this means that Peter had had enough. He was tired of stewing in the upper room. He was going to find his boat. He was going back to his former way of life. And Jesus has to meet him there, right? And it's the same story. It's a parallel to what happened the first day that Jesus called Peter. And they had caught nothing. And Jesus said, "Throw the net on the other side of the boat," right? And then they caught the great number of fish. Well, we hear that they don't catch any fish. Peter was so excited to get in his boat and go out there on the sea again, and he catches nothing, right? And so Jesus beckons to Peter again and asks 3 important questions. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Are we all familiar with that? What we don't realize there is that there are 3 Greek words there. There is, do you phileo me? Do you karatos me? Do you agape me? And Peter answers, "Yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you. I love you as a brother." Jesus asks again, "Yes, Lord, you know that I'm willing to sacrifice for you. I've already sacrificed for you. I gave up 3 years of my life for you," right? But then Jesus says, "Do you agape me?" Peter knows in the back of his head, I denied this man 3 times, and he told us to stay here. I already saw him in his resurrected state on a few occasions, and here I am on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, again finding my boat, being out there wanting to fish. And I didn't follow his instruction. And here's this man asking, do I agape him? Do I love him unconditionally? And you know what Peter answers in the Greek? He goes, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I karatos you." He was honest with Jesus at that moment, right? Words matter. And today we hear there's this casual glance and this curiosity, and then they go in and they start kind of putting it together. Then they look at each other and they get it. And what did they see? Well, they saw a shelf, and on that shelf were the shroud, but there was another distinct garment that was wrapped up near the top of the shroud. It was all folded up. So they're looking, and basically they're seeing kind of like this deflated burial cloth that still has bands around it. But on the top, they see something that would have went around Jesus' head. When we look at the shroud, we're going to notice that right here on each side of Jesus' face, we notice there's an area that's missing in the shroud. We notice that that is not included in the image of the shroud. And that was the piece that went under his chin right here to keep his jaw closed, that had been wrapped around his head. And that's important because we have to understand it from a Jewish mind. When people ate the Seder meal, and the Seder meal was done, the man who led the Seder meal would take his napkin, he would wipe his mouth, and he'd fold it up and neatly put it right in front of him on the table. And everybody knew the action was done. Just like the fourth cup. If any of you have had Mike Fulmer here before, and he has explained the fourth cup to you, the reason Jesus didn't drink the fourth cup there at the Last Supper was it wasn't done yet. It wasn't done. It was only on the cross that Jesus took the wine on the sponge, right? And said, "It is finished." And so after that event, the napkin would have been rolled up, placed on the table, and truly it was done. Everybody could get up and leave the meal. And so Peter and John are looking at this deflated burial cloth in front of them with all the bands around it. John knew what it looked like. He was there during the burial. And then there was that cloth right there that would have been inside, wrapped right there next to the head. And they realized Jesus did this to tell us that he was in charge of all this. And they took the shroud. And I want you to just kind of think, who would have taken the time with soldiers, with all the suspicion around Jesus' death and who he was, who would have taken Jesus' body naked out of that and gone through all the trouble to present that presentation like that? Who had time to do that Easter Sunday morning? It meant something powerful to Peter and John. And later that afternoon, Jesus appeared to them in resurrected form. But John is telling us this so we know what they saw when they went to the tomb that morning and why this is so important. Now, after the shroud leaves the tomb, eventually it finds its way to Edessa, Turkey. From Edessa, it goes to Constantinople. It was there for a very long period of time, till the early 1200s. And then it's carried away and it goes to France. And it finds its way at the House of Savoy. And there it's displayed in the cathedral. It's kept in a reliquary. And there was a huge fire there. There was a fire in Constantinople. There's a fire in France. There's a fire in 1997 in Turin. The shroud miraculously survives all three of those fires. And in the early 1980s, the shroud is gifted in 1983 to the Vatican. And so the Archbishop of Turin, God bless him, has to be the custodian of the most studied object in the world, the Shroud of Turin, where today it's in a bomb-proof vault that rivals what the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Oh, excuse me. As of a week and a half ago, not the Declaration of Independence, because our president has moved the Declaration of Independence to the Oval Office. There are some things that I agree with the president on and some things I don't, okay? I'm sure all of you are like that, okay? But I'm just here to tell you, I wish he would have kept the Declaration at the archives so we all could enjoy it if we go to Washington. But anyway, it's in a bomb-proof vault, right? And it's nitrogen-filled. And when you go to Turin, it's the same technology. It's a long vault. It's about 15 feet long. It's about 5 feet wide. And there's this pneumatic device, and the shroud usually lays flat. And what happens is, when it's time for it to be shown, it literally lifts up on a pneumatic device and it can be displayed vertically. But the problem is in 2003, when the shroud was cleaned, they took all of this material off. And it had a backing on it. And they took the backing off. And so now it's in its very raw form. So when you literally lift it up in the vault, it weighs down a little bit. And so this year, you were supposed to be able to go to Turin during this Jubilee year and see the shroud. I wanted to go see the Shroud, okay? I would have been willing to wait in line all day long, put my sunscreen on in Italy. It's brutal to go there, okay? During the spring, the summer, and the fall, it's hot as heck, just like it is here in South Louisiana. You know, put all that sunscreen on and go wait in line to go look at the Shroud for, about 10 minutes before they shoo you out. So the other 30 million people who are going to Italy this year during the Jubilee can see the Shroud too, okay? They decided at the last minute not to put the Shroud on display. And the reason is they feel like having the Shroud lifted vertically without all the supporting material on the back of the Shroud and just holding it up that long would do permanent damage to the Shroud. So it's not on display during the Jubilee year. So I'm going to have to go next year to Italy instead of this year. But if the Shroud would have been on display, I would have been in line and my head would have been all red and I would have paid the price of waiting out in the sun all day long, you know, with my people to go see the Shroud. So there's a definite path that we see with the Shroud. And where do we see it? We see it in this image down here and called the Prayer Codex, which dates back to 1192. We see here that there are some nuns repairing the Shroud after a fire that had some burn marks on the Shroud. Okay? Now let's talk a little bit about a carbon dating. How many of you have heard about the carbon dating of the Shroud that basically said it was a forgery? Raise your hand. Father Lamar is the only one raised. Okay, we got a few other people who are participating. Good. I'm happy y'all aren't at St. Alphonsus tonight. When I ask questions and no one raises their hands, all hell breaks loose. They know that I'm wanting to get their participation, right? That Mass isn't a spectator sport, right? So when I ask them a question during the homily, you know, I like them to answer, right? Yes. Okay. So with that said, we look a little bit at the carbon dating. So what happened is in 1978, the Vatican, as the House of Savoy is allowing, you know, the Vatican to have the Shroud, the Vatican says, in the spirit of ecumenism, we're going to let experts from around the world come in, and over the course of about 5 days, we're going to let all of you scientists come in who are curious about the Shroud, and we're going to let about 35 of you come in, and you're going to have exclusive access to the Shroud. And so they came in, they photographed the Shroud, they looked at it under magnifying glasses, they literally took samples of pollen off of the Shroud. So you had botanists, you had, you know, forensic scientists, you had chemists, you had textile experts, you had photography experts, and you had experts in things like blood and paint. They were all there, and literally they're not even wearing gloves and they're handling the Shroud. There's literally video footage of the Shroud of Turin research project called STIRP looking at the Shroud, okay? So in 1988, they decided to take a 8-centimeter piece of the Shroud and they did a cutting from the corner of the Shroud. And they sent it to 3 laboratories throughout the world. They sent it to Zurich, they sent it to Oxford University, and they sent one to the University of Arizona, to the Los Alamos laboratory where there was a carbon dating machine. And all 3 of the carbon datings came back, and none of them came back with the same time period. It dated from like the 1290s to the end of the 1300s. And once they got all of that information, they decided to publish it, but it wasn't published in a scholarly journal. That wasn't what was wanted. They wanted to publish it in a magazine, so I know that some of you, I'm looking around the room, you remember the 1980s. You remember when your kids went to school and they had the magazine sale? I remember this, right? They came in and, you know, you sold so many magazines, you got this prize, and you sold this many magazines, you got this prize. And if you were the true entrepreneur and you sold over 100 magazine subscriptions, you got the big boom box with the little black and white TV on it, right? Back in the early 1980s. And, all of us who were in school then, we drooled and we wanted to go sell magazines. And one of those magazines was a magazine called Nature. How many of you remember getting Nature magazine in the mail? Okay, good, one. He's awake. Okay, good. So, Nature magazine, and it was published in 1988, the results that the Shroud was a forgery. It was a clever forgery from medieval times because carbon dating doesn't lie. Or does it? Well, carbon dating usually doesn't lie. The problem is, what you're carbon dating. Could it possibly be that that wasn't actually the original part of the Shroud? And that's where, we start talking about the evidence for the Shroud, why we believe it's the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. You're taking something that's been exposed to human hands, smoke, bacteria, movement across different climates. It wasn't just in one spot. It's been moved around, right? I mean, you think about all of the different things that have interfered, and then where that material was gathered, it was gathered from an edge of the shroud. So, if we take this garment, we put it the way it normally would be, it'd be 14 feet long, 3 inches, and it would be 3 feet, 7 inches wide. And along the edge, of course, it had been repaired through the centuries. No one was willing to look at it and say, yeah, it may have been repaired. That only happened about the year 2005. And during that year, Ray Rogers, who had actually been one of the lead scientists, he was a thermonuclear chemist who had access to Los Alamos. He was on the Shroud of Turin research project. And he had studied the Shroud, but he was agnostic. We all know what an agnostic is, right? A person who doesn't know whether they believe in God or not. But he was open-minded to the Shroud. But after the carbon dating, which he himself was kind of part of that process, he believed the Shroud was a kind of a forgery, but he was open-minded to it. And so these amateur textile, hobbyists were actually able to go to Los Alamos, and they pulled out a microscope and they looked at the weave of the little sample left from the Shroud that wasn't subject to carbon dating. It was actually a little piece of the sample that was still in a vault at Los Alamos. They looked at it and they noticed something very interesting. They saw flax or linen, but intertwined into it was cotton. And they realized in the late 1500s, early 1600s, after the fire that had taken place in France, some nuns, we have some here this evening, some very clever ladies, right? These wonderful nuns, these Carmelite nuns, they had done what was called French splice weaving. What they did was they took cotton and dyed it, and they put it in to where it actually would interlock into the weave of the original flax. And the only way you could see that is to look at the material under a microscope. And they said, the reason that the carbon dating came back as late as it did is because you're looking at first century material that's been weaved into material that's only 400 years old. That nuns literally dyed this material and expertly weaved it together. And Ray Rogers read that article and he had a fit. He said, there's no way. I examined this with my own eyes through a magnifying glass. So he had cancer at that time. He was dying from cancer. He goes to Los Alamos and he says, I demand to see the samples that these people looked at. And he looked under a microscope and he realized at that moment that he was wrong and Nature magazine was wrong. That indeed this material was a mix between modern cotton, modern in the sense that It's been within the last 500 years, right? And this ancient linen that dates from the 1st century. Just this last year, a study came out, and it was a study that showed where they looked with X-ray, modern X-ray technology, at a piece of cloth that was found in Masada this last century, and the Shroud of Turin, and it was made in the same place in the 1st century. It was made somewhere between Jericho and Jerusalem. And it's a Syrian model. It's a double herringbone weave. Very expensive material, linen. And there's only 1 or 2 people who could have afforded this, that it would be near Jesus at the time that he needed to be buried. 1 or 2 people. Would anybody like to venture to guess who those 1 or 2 people might be? Father Lamar? Okay, or Nicodemus, one of the two. But we know Joseph provided the burial place. But we also have to ask the question, who literally owned the place where Jesus celebrated the Last Supper, right? Because something else we discovered after we took the shroud and we started vacuuming things off the shroud in 2003 after John Paul II authorized that to happen, is we realized that there on the shroud, on one end of the shroud, there's some stains. And in those stains, there's these remnants of herbs, like olive oil that would have been cleverly mixed with some herbs, like a sauce that people would have dipped things in. Now, I want you to think of the company Jesus kept. These 12 men, right? And I want you to think about them sitting at a table. And by the way, you know, they wouldn't have sat at a table like we envision them sitting at a table, okay? They literally would have been reclining on the floor with their feet behind them on one end of a table, and the table would have been in the shape of a U, okay? And on the part of the table where Jesus was, there would have been a beautiful, elaborate linen made to impress a good guest. And on one side of that table, where these men probably were sitting, I wouldn't think it would be on the other end of the table, right? But right in front of them were these little stains along one end of the shroud. We also believe the shroud was at a meal. And what do you think that meal was? The Last Supper. Isn't it interesting? You know, when we start to look at the readings for Holy Week, there's one of the prefaces that talks about how Jesus was the lamb, right? The altar, and the priest, right? And so it should not shock us that God, who engineered this for our belief, it wouldn't also have a connection to the one and the same event, if you will. When we look at the Triduum, it's all connected, right? The condemnation, the suffering, the crucifixion, the death, and the resurrection, and you can include the ascension in there. It's all part of the Paschal mystery, right? And so literally here at the Shroud, we're connecting Holy Thursday with Easter Sunday, right? And perhaps on the day of the Ascension, this was there too, at the Mount of Olives. Who knows? But indeed, there's a connection between all of this that only God can engineer. We know that a bone of his shall not be broken. Now, it's very difficult for Jesus to go through everything that he endured without suffering a broken bone. There were certain things that suffered great injury on Jesus as we look at the shroud. When we look at the shroud up here, we're going to notice that Jesus' right shoulder is slightly lower than the left shoulder. Do you know why? Because his shoulder was dislocated. A dislocated shoulder is not the same as a broken shoulder. We know when we look at the shroud that Jesus has a deviated septum right here. because he fell face forward on his way, because he's holding on his shoulders a crossbeam that weighed upwards of 110 pounds. And as Jesus falls, he's falling on travertine. We often think that, Jesus was falling into dust. Jerusalem had been renovated by Romans. Travertine is very unforgiving when you fall upon it. And embedded in what's called the sudarium and also in the shroud, as they were vacuuming certain elements of the shroud, they found remnants of this travertine aggregate mixed with blood and other bodily fluid on the area of Jesus' face. It matches the same material that's in Jerusalem in the tombs that date back to the time of Jesus. That was off the shroud. There are many wounds that Jesus endures to his body. We might say, well, how did they crucify this man and not break bones in his hands? Well, that was a very clever way that they did crucifixion in Jesus' day and time. There are two things you could believe about how Jesus was crucified when it came to his hands. So as you look at the mystics of the church, they say that truly the nail was in the middle of Jesus' hands, but it came out back here through the back of the wrist. When we look here at the shroud, you're going to see that only one of those is visible. But there's something important when we look at the shroud that tells us about how this man was crucified. The Romans wanted, when you crucified a man, to pierce the median nerve. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie The Equalizer #3 with Denzel Washington. There's a very famous scene in that movie. He goes and he is having a dinner, and the mob comes in, the mafia. And they go and they terrorize a police officer and his family at the table. They want to threaten him. And they're basically like, if you challenge us, we're going to do something worse than just slice your ear off. We're going to take care of your whole family. We're going to kill them, all this stuff. And they see Denzel Washington sitting in the corner, and the mob boss gets up and he goes and he sits at the table. And he goes, you always are interfering in other people's business. And Denzel Washington says, well, I don't really want to, but you kind of force that upon me. And the guy basically, is about to hit Denzel Washington. Denzel Washington grabs his hand and he pushes on that man's hand on the median nerve. Where is the median nerve? Well, if you take your thumb and you push right here on your hand, you're going to feel the median nerve pretty quickly. Right here. Some of you have the little M in the middle of your palm, kind of at the base of where that little middle part of the M would be. If you push right there, you're going to feel the median nerve. Push a little harder and it's going to hurt. You're going to know. And immediately, if you really push, you're going to notice that it starts affecting your thumb. If you pierce the median nerve, you lose all function of your thumb. It's going to protract into your hand when you pierce the median nerve. When you come up to the shroud after the presentation tonight, I want you to look at Jesus' hand. As he's, what you're going to see on both hands, you're only going to see 4 fingers. They didn't slice his thumb off. His thumbs are protracted in. They did what they set out to do. And whether you go into the hand this way and it comes out through there, or if you put it through here and it comes out through here, it does the same effect. You can support the weight of a man to where the nail is not pulling out through his flesh. If you can go in through here and you can pierce that median nerve. If you read the mystics of the church, they're going to tell you that the nail went through the middle of the hand and it came out through here. If you read Pierre Bourbet's book, A Doctor at Calvary, very famous book from 1950, which by the way has been reprinted since the shroud has become popular in modern society again. Pierre, good French name. Y'all all should know how to spell Pierre. Barbet, B-A-R-B-E-T, a doctor of Calvary. When he examines the shroud, he believes that the nail went through here. If you read some of the mystics of the church, they're going to tell you in their vision, they see that the nail goes this way and out the back. So 2 different entry points, but same wound. Some people say, well, Father, what do you believe? Well, people who have the stigmata show the wound right here. Okay? Whichever way you desire, it pierced the median nerve. We see that. They did what they set out to do. Okay? And so we see that. We see in Jesus' feet that his feet are also pierced, and we see that a lance went through Jesus' right side, right here. Remember, we have a mirrored view. So as we're looking at it, we're understanding that Jesus' body was pressed against this image. If it's not a medieval forgery, what are we looking at today? And the answer is, we are looking at the very moment of Jesus' resurrection. That's why we see what we see on the shroud. When we look at the shroud today, if this is a medieval forgery, it means that there should be paint on the shroud. There's no paint at all on the shroud. There are no brush strokes on the shroud. What do we see on a shroud? We see a scorched image of a man. And at that moment, the intense heat had to be hot enough to scorch the linen, but not so hot that it would cause the linen to catch on fire and be destroyed. Literally, that scorch in the actual flax itself, the linen, is 1/4 of a diameter the size of a hair on your head. You can take a razor and literally scrape that off if you had to on the shroud. There's blood on the shroud. And if it was a clever forgery from the medieval times, well, you had to get the blood right. What do I mean by that? Are any of you familiar with the Eucharistic miracles of the world? You know, one of our newest saints next month is going to be Blessed Carlo Acutis. He will be Saint Carlo Acutis. He's already Saint Carlo Acutis. It's just the church is going to make him officially Saint Carlo Acutis. On the day of his burial, the world knew he was Saint Carlo Acutis. He was Santo Subito, 15-year-old boy who died in 2005 from leukemia. Loved computers, loved the church, loved the Eucharist, put all that together and gave us the Eucharistic miracles of the world exposition, as well as the Marian apparitions of the world, a presentation on heaven, hell, and purgatory, and also angels and demons. There are 4 presentations that he put together, but his most famous is Eucharistic miracles of the world. And in it, he talks about the Eucharistic miracle of Lanciano. In the 1970s, scientists, around the same time that the shroud was being examined by Stirp, scientists went and they were given access to study the Eucharistic miracle of Lanciano, probably the most famous Eucharistic miracle in the history of the Catholic world. It took place 1,200 years ago in the 800s in a little tiny village on the eastern side of Italy overlooking the Adriatic Sea, otherwise known as the northern part of the Mediterranean. Do you know what's so important about the Eucharistic miracle of Lanciano? This is the town that St. Longinus, the soldier who thrust the lance into Jesus' side, this is the town he was from. When Longinus thrust his lance into the side of Jesus, it pierced his heart and blood and water came forth. And he uttered, "Truly this was the Son of God." Do you know why he uttered that? Because that day, this man who suffered from what we would consider today tunnel vision or legal blindness, was cured of his blindness at the foot of the cross. As the blood and water that came forth from Jesus' side hit him in his face, he was able to see again. That's why he was relegated to crucifixion duty instead of being a soldier out on a battlefield. He could not see like other soldiers could. This is where the Eucharistic miracle took place, in a church in that town where he was from. The area of the host, where it's from in the heart, is the exact place where the lance was cast through Jesus' side. That part of the heart. And as scientists researched it, they found that the blood of the Eucharistic miracle was AB blood. 4% of the human population has AB blood. It's a very rare blood type. In the early 2000s, there was a Eucharistic miracle in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio was the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires at that time. He saw the Eucharistic miracle. He sent it off for investigation, AB blood. There was another Eucharistic miracle that happened in Italy in the town of Bolsena, Orvieto Bolsena, where the host, the priest, was unbelieving in the transubstantiation at Mass. And literally, as he held the Eucharist up, the host bled onto the corporal. We still have that corporal today in the church's history, AB blood. So, medieval forgery. It's painted. No, it's not. You got to get the blood right. Do y'all know when blood types were known? Blood types were discovered in the year 1900 by an Austrian, what do you call them? Like a forensic expert, a doctor, a physician. He discovered blood types. He won the Nobel Prize in science that year in 1900. So if this was done between 1290 and 1390 as a medieval forgery, and you were going to put blood on it, you would have had to know blood types. That wasn't possible. We only knew blood types in 1900. How likely would you have been to get the right blood type that matches every Eucharistic miracle in the world? Not only that Eucharistic miracle and this shroud, but there's another linen that went on Jesus' head that connects in 50 places exactly where we see wound marks on Jesus' head on the shroud. That's called the Sudarium of Oviedo. And that also has a blood. So you understand there's a connection between all of this. There's a connection between all of this. We have tried as humans now with the shroud to replicate this, to literally put lights inside of a linen and give off a certain light so that we can take this and try to replicate it. We haven't been able to do it yet. It's something only God could do at the moment of the resurrection. In 2003, when we vacuumed the shroud, we found all kinds of pollen on the shroud. And we segregated it, and we found over 45 species of plants. And that pollen only blooms at a certain time of the year. Some of that pollen belongs to plants that were in Jerusalem. Some of that pollen was from Turkey. Some of that pollen was from Byzantium or Constantinople. Some of it was from France, like lavender, that blooms in the spring in France. And some from Turin. It's not anywhere else in the world that we find any of that pollen, any other place in the shroud. It literally follows the path. God has preserved this through 3 major fires. One, it should have been totally destroyed in France. It was in a silver reliquary, and the fire destroyed the cathedral around it, the Cathedral of Savoy, France. And so the reliquary got so hot that literally the silver melted, and the shroud was all folded within it. And the silver came and landed on the shroud, but it didn't damage anything in the middle of the shroud. It damaged everything on the outside in the folds of the shroud. It preserved everything that we needed still to see. You know, there's a lot of stuff we could talk about with Jesus' wounds and about the authenticity of the shroud. But there's one thing about the shroud that I think is important for us to know, and it has to do with the face of Christ on the shroud. I want you to think, if you were tortured for 18 hours, it began on Holy Thursday night. Jesus prays his prayer of unity that's found in John chapter 17. They leave the upper room. Jesus has not consumed the fourth cup. They leave. Jesus kind of ends the Seder meal in a way that was very unique for these Jewish men. They go over and he says, "Pray with me." And as he's there at this massive rock in the Garden of Gethsemane, a rock that's still today in the Church of All Nations up there on the Mount of Olives today across the Kidron Valley, you go there and you could celebrate Mass at an altar right there at the rock. I hope one day, if you haven't been to the Holy Land, the war will end and we could all go back and start going to the Holy Land again. Because when you go to the Holy Land, you realize how small Jesus' world really is, you know. But you go there, and at that rock, there's a moment where Jesus experiences one of the first tortures, and that's when he sweats blood. Literally, the blood vessels pop, and there's this moment where blood comes forth from it. It's called hematidrosis, I think is, or something like that, okay? Once again, I'm not the medical expert. If Father Carey were here, he'd be here going, "No, Jason, it's da-da-da-da-da." So this is my moment of humility that I get that word wrong, right? But I think it's called hematidrosis, I think is the term. Anything after that would have happened to Jesus over the course of the next few days would have been excruciatingly painful because it supersensitizes everything about that person over the next several hours and days. Your body is fighting off its own response to stress and anxiety. And so Jesus is there and he's praying. He's seeing what's about to happen. And then he's arrested and he's brought before the chief priests. He's accused of blasphemy at that moment. He's struck in the face. You look at the image of Jesus, you're going to see that one side of his face, his eye, is completely swollen where he was hit that evening. Because he was accused of blasphemy, he would have been subject to lashes with a reed that night, not to exceed 39 lashes. But we forget that Jesus probably endured this that evening as punishment for committing that blasphemy. He is brought that evening to Herod. He says nothing before Herod. He's brought back to the home of Caiaphas, and he's put in a cistern for a few hours till the early hours of the morning when he is brought before Pilate. He has at this time gone through that sweating of the blood, through being beaten with a reed already, and then Pontius Pilate decides he's going to have him scourged. And folks, what we see on the shroud here, all 240 lashes on the back, the 120 on Jesus' front, was from a whip that had pieces of leather strap that came out from it. And at the end were pieces of little metal, like little nails. There were shark's teeth. There were pieces of lead with little balls on each side with the strap tied in the middle. And it had about 4 or 5 of these little pieces that ran off of it. They would have tied Jesus to a small little column. They would have bent him down, would have started to systematically whip him from the top to the bottom. One man on one side, the one on Jesus' left behind him, landing blows directly with his right hand, would have hit Jesus more accurately and with greater force. And we see that when we look at the shroud. How one guy was hitting much more brutally than the guy on this side who was landing blows this way. After that, we know, of course, that Jesus not only endured the trauma of the crown of thorns, but then he had to march about 4 football fields length from what we believe today, not to, discount the good Franciscans who proposed the Via Dolorosa happened a certain way, but the starting point where they say it happened, there was not a praetorium in the first century there. There was a pool at that moment. The praetorium that's there at the beginning of what is the Via Dolorosa today existed from the 2nd century only. But we believe, since we have found the palace of Herod, that Pontius Pilate would have stayed there. So the route from the 8th station onward is correct. The first part, we don't know necessarily if it's truly accurate, okay? I don't mean for you to doubt if you went down the Via Dolorosa whether you took the right route or not. That's not important. We know that Jesus had to march a distance of a little over 400 yards between the place where he was condemned and the place where he ultimately was nailed to the cross. And as that happened, he was pulled with a very thick rope or chain that tore up all of this area right here, as we see with the shroud. I want you to realize something, that Jesus' body was cleaned before he was placed in the shroud. But it was a very preliminary cleaning. It was a very quick cleaning. He had to be put in the tomb by 6 o'clock on Good Friday evening because of the Passover that was approaching. And so we look at that and we realize how Jesus was pretty much drug along. And as he falls, probably not 3 times, maybe not even 5 or 7 times, but at one point he falls, and of course his shoulder is dislocated. He can't go much further with that. The soldiers recognize that. That's when Simon is brought forward, right? There's one point where Jesus has to stop, and he literally has to go through what's called the judgment gate. And this is probably where Jesus was able to talk to the women of Jerusalem. I don't know where else Jesus would have been able to stop and give the homily he gives in Luke's gospel to the women of Jerusalem, okay? But it probably happened there. We still have the threshold of the judgment gate in Jerusalem today. But as he gets there, we realize at that moment that the soldiers had a job to do, and they had to do it with exacting perfection. It was an art form to put this man to death. And as we look and we think about all 18 hours of that suffering, between noon and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, depending on the gospel that you read, you look at that face of Jesus, and I want you to realize there's only one man who could have been put to death this way, and he would have that look on his face. It would be the man who would understand why he came to this earth and what he was going to do when he took his last breath and died. And that was to redeem the human race. No other tortured victim who went through all that I have described to you would have that look of peace on his face. My dear friends, not too many years ago, about 100 years ago, the world started to unearth Pompeii in Italy. And when Mount Vesuvius erupted and this pyroclasmic blast comes down the mountain, there were people who had not evacuated the town. And as this hot ash just enveloped them and they started to writhe in pain and their skin started to burn around them, their faces are forever preserved in Pompeii today. As archaeologists were uncovering the city, they came across cavities in the earth. And they finally realized that this is the place where human beings were and had died. They took resin and they poured it in and it hardened. And afterward they dug around it, and what they figured out was that they could, at that moment, have a snapshot of what these human beings looked like as the ash was encircling them and they were dying horrible, excruciating deaths. And the look of agony that's on their face is pronounced. If you look at the man and the image in the shroud, you see a man whose face has utmost peace upon it. And of all the things that we have discussed tonight about the shroud, that, in my opinion, is the proof that this is the burial shroud of none other than Jesus Christ. Only the God-made man would give his life and have that look of peace on his face. The same face that has guided the hands of artists, iconographers through the centuries. My dear friends, that is the evidence that the burial cloth that we look upon is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. That's my presentation tonight. I want to ask if any of you have any questions this evening. Yes, ma'am. From the shroud, we see that the wound is on the right. I don't know. Yes. Artists have their interpretation of certain things, yes. It's just like Frank Hayden over at St. Alphonsus. You know, if you look at the crucifix of Frank Hayden's, his hands are not proportionate to the rest of his body. Because Frank Hayden wanted to show the pain Jesus endured in his hands. That his hands are kind of like they're reaching out for us on the cross. Yeah, could be the artist. It's just like, to give you an example, I think your stations actually start on this side and work their way this way. By the way, the stations can go either way. Normally, you have to follow the path that Jesus is walking to tell which way you place the stations in the church. So in this, it all looks like he's walking in this direction. So your stations are placed in the right way, by the way. Some stations begin on one side and end on the other side. In this, they're placed in the direction in which Jesus is walking, which is correct. So, but if you look here at the 12th station, I guarantee you, if you look at the 12th station, and you can't really see it, but always you see Mary and John literally like right at Jesus' feet, like you can touch Jesus on the cross. That's not historically accurate either. People couldn't get that close to a true crucifixion. You didn't want to be that close to a crucifixion. Mary, it shows her great courage as the mother of Jesus that she had to be about 85 feet away from Jesus, because we have a marker in the Holy Sepulchre today that is the marker of the Sorrowful Mother, the place where she and John and the other Marys were. But the reason we place them like that is because we're trying to paint the scene with the space we have, right? And so that's always kind of like the artist's representation of the scene. And so for those of you who are like, golly, Father, you're ruining it for us, by me telling you historically where we understand where Mary and the other Marys were, I want you to think about the conviction Jesus had at the moment that he says, woman, behold your son. John, behold your mother. The importance of Jesus on the cross, suffering, barely able to breathe, to be able to get that out so that Mary and John, who are distanced from him, can hear that. It makes you understand a little bit more the trauma Mary had to endure with the space that was placed between her and Jesus, and the love Jesus had for her, that he got that out to where he could be heard. That's very important for us to understand at that moment. So, artist's representation of things, as I mentioned when we were looking at the crown of thorns at the beginning, right? It colors our understanding of things, but when we go and we truly get to the place where Jesus suffered and died, was buried, and we look at his whole ministry with the geography and things, it becomes so apparent of what they're trying to tell us in the scriptures, right? In describing things. Yes, sir. What's that? I don't believe the Vatican has ever released DNA evidence. Whether it's ever been looked at, I don't know. I know that the science in the 70s was a certain science. The DNA of things like, or the pollen, things like that, I know have been released. But I don't know about DNA. I don't think there's ever been true DNA tests that have been done to compare. Keep in mind, DNA is relatively new in the church's eye. Well, I don't think we want to do that. So that's a good question, though, about the DNA. I've always wondered that myself. Anybody else have any questions this evening? Well, I want to thank y'all for coming tonight. Before you leave this evening, I do want to make sure that you're able to come up here and look at the images. Really take a look at the negatives. You've been looking at the positive image, but the negatives, every time I go to a church, the way that the power is set up and everything is different. So we had to fish and try to find an extension cord to get power to those images. But if you look, the negative images, particularly with the wounds, is important. Look at those and understand that someone in medieval times, if they wanted to create a medieval forgery, to understand that they had to use blood that had broken down to create blood serum halos, how would they have known that without understanding ultraviolet light 700 years ago? It's just stuff like that if you believe it's a medieval forgery, you have a real uphill climb to try to prove that theory. So, anyway. Say that again? Those are actually the distortions from the scorch marks from the fires that you see. Remember that those negatives come from 1898. or from 1978, before they took all that material off. So the same image from 1978 and 1898, because the shroud was relatively unchanged during those times, other than a fire the fire was in 97, so. Good Father, thank you for the invitation tonight.
Thank you very much for coming out. Sammy and Charlie are going to pass the basket. If you'd like to gift Father Jason with something this evening. You know, I think Father Jason has presented enough evidence that creates reasonable doubt that this is a forgery. And there's more and more stuff that's coming out that's challenging the atheistic point of view when it comes to holy objects like the shroud, like the tilma from Our Lady of Guadalupe, and other images. So these are things that it's good to know about. It's good to have those aha moments and say that there's a little bit more going on in our world than we can explain. And it just helps grow the faith. So thank you, Father Jason, for coming out and sharing with us. So next Friday evening, Mr. Benton Foster will be here talking about the Eucharist, the body of Christ that we receive, the sacrament that we receive every day in the church. So please come out. If you have any kids or grandchildren, please bring them with you, because he has done his presentation for several youth groups, and the kids have just been amazed at what he has said, and he's kept their attention. So,
if any of you have a fascination with this, in the last few years, there have been two wonderful books that have been presented modern times. This is the classic, A Doctored Calvary. We mentioned that by Pierre Barbet. What's interesting is Father himself here knew that I have this as a hobby, so he gave me this book. So I got this book off of Amazon, okay. But he gave me this book. This is a very recently written book with a lot of the newer evidence in it. This is by Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, and this is the Shroud of Jesus and the sign John ingeniously concealed. This is recent. This was just published, and this book actually is only about 3 or 4 years old too. And if you are fascinated by this beautiful relic that we possess, which I believe is of Jesus Christ himself, this has wonderful pictures, and it actually illustrates how the shroud in Constantinople would have been on display for the first 1,000 years. It's a very interesting book. So, okay, thank you. I'll be around if anyone has any questions.